Well, Resonate, I'm exceedingly glad that you guys are here today in this place. And also, man, we are so excited to have Central Washington University, Eastern Washington University, to have you guys with us via video. And it's a great day. It's a great moment for us. If you're here and maybe this is your first time to ever come to Resonate Church, what we're going to be diving into today, it might feel as if somehow you're kind of looking into what is happening through a window, kind of on the outside. And I just want to let you know we understand that. We understand how some of this content may land. And I just want you to know, man, we're so glad that you are here, even as we begin to get into this. And as we begin to press into what we've been walking through, I really want to do a couple of things. I want to build a couple of cases for you and then bring together what I feel like God is calling us together as a church to do, and hopefully have a moment where we can begin to say, what does this look like in our lives? We began this whole process by asking this question about what is our purpose, and understanding that when we live as people with purpose, it really clarifies all the decisions that we make in our life. It begins to have a lot of moments where we begin to say that's an easy decision. It's not a complex decision when we have that clarity. It also allows us to have an immense amount of joy to be able to see, okay, here's what I've been created to do. Here's what I've been designed to do. Here's how I do something that is significant, and really breaking down this understanding of God who created us to live a significant life, and really pointing this idea towards realizing that our hearts are pointed towards eternity. And really what that means is to live beyond the cycle of the everyday. And the everyday, at some point in our life, every single one of us are going to get to this place where if we just live for the everyday, that cycle, we're going to say, hey, this is meaningless. And really, this is not what God has called us to do. And He's clarified us living a different kind of life. And in this, not only that when we begin to say that's the why, and we begin to have the why, it begins to help us have impact to the what of our life. And each and every one of us do things in our life, and helping us to understand why do we do what we do, and how do we understand how to make that the highest impact that we can. And so today we come to this last moment where we talk about how does that work. So we have the why, the what, and my hope is that we begin to have clarity on the how of this. And I really want for this to kind of get down to brass tacks and to get into the details of our life. And so first of all, I want to help us to understand the fact is that God has called us together as a church, and the kind of church that God has called us into is one that has a movement-oriented cultural impact at the end of it. That's the kind of the destination, the trajectory of our church. And I want to talk about what Jesus said and what that's looked like. I also want to look at the historicity of this to be able to see where we've seen the church accelerate in this and kind of put all the pieces together and hopefully end up in a place where we can kind of get clarity in what this looks like in our lives. The first thing when we begin to see what Jesus said in this, when we begin to see what Jesus called us to do, that in the midst of Him rising from the dead after He was crucified on a Roman cross, it's this momentous moment in history when we begin to see the power of sin broken, the power of death broken. And what happens is we might expect Jesus to stick around and lead the church and create His kingdom, but what He does is He leaves, and He leaves us with instructions. And the instructions that He leaves us are in Matthew chapter 28, and they're called, in verse 18, these are called the Great Commission. And I want to start off there and help us to understand what Jesus is telling us to do in order for us to fulfill what He's called us to do. It says this, in verse 18, it says, "Then Jesus came to them and said, 'All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you to the very end of the age.'" And so to these probably 120 followers, what He does is He says, I'm going to imprint the necessity of what you're to do from here on out. So in this, Jesus is clarifying, this is what the role, this is what the mission of the church is, and in the context of people who are connected to Jesus, this is what this is supposed to look like, right? And so this is really clear. What he says there, we talked about this idea, he says, because I have done what I've done, because I have overcome the grave, because of the resurrection, there is authority. And so last week we talked about this idea that verse 19, it says, therefore go. But the real operative word here, the active participle here is make disciples. And then we see everything else following how you're to make disciples. But what is incredibly clear in this moment is that in this, what Jesus is calling his church to do is very singular. What the mission of God on this earth is to do is to make duplicates of Jesus. That we are to see the role of the church is to duplicate who Jesus was on this earth in order to restore the world. And this is this key thing, because when we begin to miss this, oftentimes we can begin to think, okay, the role of the church is to gather believers, right? So they can feel like there is this community that understands this worldview of morality that's found in the gospel, right? Or it's this thing that's gathered together so that we might be inspired, that we might be able to live lives that are righteous and not sinful. Or we're to simply take and be able to meet needs of the world around us. And all of these are good things, but these are not what the church was called to do. The church was called to make duplicates of Jesus. You and I, if we were to say, well, I'm a follower of Christ, here's the clarity of what this means, that we are to make duplicates of Jesus, that who Jesus was, we are to say what it looks like is to follow Jesus and do what Jesus did. Now, this is different than making converts. This is different than bringing people together and creating social movements. This is something that is fundamentally different, because when we understand this, a convert is someone who maybe has their mindset changed, or their worldview changed, but their actions don't change. And so oftentimes the church can be called very hypocritical, because what we say is we want to be like Jesus, right? We want to have that unconditional love, the grace, the redemption, all this stuff that Jesus is. But we are people that oftentimes have the mentality of Jesus, have the mindset of a worldview of morality, and that's kind of how we base the way that we live, but it doesn't actually go out into our behavior. Jesus says a disciple is a duplicate of me, so that we begin to understand what this is about. And we have to understand, as a church, this is what we've been called to do. You and I, the call upon our life is to make duplicates of Jesus. That's it. Now, we gather together, and that's inspiring. We do things out of the name of Jesus, and that's helpful to the world around us, but that's not the primary mission. It's to create disciples. And what does disciples do? When disciples gather together, they create the church, the expansion of the church, the movement-oriented thing. This is what Jesus says, here's what I'm to do. And here's the thing is, I'm going to be with you, and I'm going to give you the power, and I've given you my authority. The first thing we have to understand is we're called to make disciples. The second thing is we need to understand is that Jesus has given us authority and power to do so. Now, the idea that I think that oftentimes we would assume is that Jesus, as he overcomes death, he begins to lead the organization. And this is what makes a whole lot of sense, that Jesus, if he was here, that he would be the pastor of this church, right? That Jesus would be in this place. That every sermon would be the best sermon you've ever heard. Every decision would be spot on with the will of God, right? And all of this stuff we'd be asking Jesus, tell me what, because I'm going directly to you. But here's what Jesus says. It's not best that I stay here and be the leader of all of this stuff. What is best is if I go away, and then I'm going to send you the power of the Holy Spirit, and that's going to be better for all humanity, because there's a movement that's going to happen when I send the Holy Spirit into the world to the followers of Jesus, to my followers. And this is this kind of mind-blowing idea. And in this, what we begin to see is that Jesus says, I have given you the authority to make this happen. And we get really amped up about what Jesus did, who Jesus was, and what he did on the cross. And we sing about Jesus redeeming us, that our guilt is taken and removed, and because of his sacrifice on the cross, that we might be able to have access to everything that is good everything that is holy to a righteous God. And that is a huge thing, that humanity is no longer separated from God, but ultimately Jesus built a bridge that we might be able to have a relationship with the God that we alienated with our sin. We sing a lot about that, and we talk a lot about that, and we can get very emotionally connected to that. But that is if we can kind of take that and just say, man, I'm so excited to be in the club, to have heaven as my destination and have no guilt in life, and to be able to have hope and to be able to have all of this. But this is not the entire gospel, because Jesus says, I've given you this truth, but the mission of your life is to have this empowered in your life so that you might live a life on mission. So it's a little bit like this, that we would be able to finally get this car, right? We would be able to say, man, I finally have wheels and I have a car, and I've never had a car before, and this is amazing. But what the car does is it stays in the garage, it stays in the driveway, it stays out on the street, and we begin to say, man, I'm so excited to have this car. I'm so pumped. We tell people about the car that we have, but we never drive the stinking car, that we don't use it. It just sits out there, and people say, why do you have a car? You're not going to be able to use it, right? There's something that's been given to us that we might be able to use this gift of salvation, to be able to extend the gospel to all people. And so here's what Jesus said: I have given you this authority. I have overcome sin and death. That wherever the gospel is brought into this world, it's going to have power to counteract sin and darkness. It's a little bit like this. Throughout the Bible, what we see is this metaphor of light, that whenever light enters into any kind of space, what happens is immediately, always, forever, darkness flees. It's just a part of physics. That when we see darkness, it is the absence of light. And when the switch is flipped on, when the power is given there, that light comes into that room, and darkness doesn't struggle. You know, there's not this fight of physics between the light and the dark. It is immediately, ultimately, darkness is removed from whatever context that is in. And this is this beautiful understanding of what you and I are equipped with. That you and I are equipped with this light of the world. That you and I are equipped to be able to have something that affects all the world around us. This is our little light, right? And we are to shine our little light. And this is kind of what it's connected to. That we are called to make duplicates of Jesus. And God has given us absolute power. And I believe that we don't understand near the kind of power that God has given us to extend the gospel. And we are operating on just a percentage of what God has gifted us to say, hey, I want to blow the world up. I want for this to change. And I've given you everything that you need to do this. And this is where I think that we live these little bitty stories sometimes. And we live these things that we make minimal impacts in our lives because we don't realize that Jesus says, hey, I've overcome this. All the things that I've been gifted to do, you're going to do much, much more. And Jesus says it like this. In John 12, he's having this moment. And this is probably one of the most significant public celebration moments in Jesus's ministry. He's just raised Lazarus from the dead. Lazarus had been dead for 3 days. And Jesus comes and he takes and just calls out to Lazarus' name. Lazarus gets up out of the grave. Everyone's just losing their minds. It's just crazy. He's going into Jerusalem and everybody's witnessing that, hey, I saw a dude come out of the grave, not even stinky. Like, it was crazy. Jesus healed everything about him, right? And in this, the word is being spread throughout Jerusalem. In fact, it's so significant that not only Jewish people are saying, hey, I want to get a piece of this Jesus. There's something about him. But it says the Greeks are coming to him. And we're not talking about fraternity and sorority people. It's like, me too, right? We're talking about people there that were of the Greek context in their life. And in this is Jesus' great crossover act. Like, it's Coldplay coming to the United States, right? It's J-Lo doing movies, Donald Trump doing everything, right? This is the crossover moment, right? And what is happening here is Jesus is getting so big that multiple people are saying, hey, I want to be a part of this. And here's what Jesus does. He begins to give context for what we're to do. In verse 23 of chapter 12, it says this: Jesus replied, "Now the time has come for the Son of Man to enter into his glory," right? It's really significant. Everybody like, yes, you are about to just kill it, Jesus, because you're amazing at this point. And here's what he says. It kind of blows our mind. He says, "I tell you the truth, unless a kernel of wheat is planted in the soil and dies, it remains alone. But its death will produce many new kernels, a plentiful harvest of new lives. Those who love their life in this world will lose it. Those who care nothing for this life in this world will keep it for eternity." Jesus says, okay, let me give you the context for glory. Let me give you the context for significance. Let me give you an understanding of how my economy is to work. That as you begin to take this mission into the world to duplicate me, I'm going to give you power to create movements. And those movements are going to be required of you to be able to understand that your life is not just a seed. And again, we're around, in this context of being in an agrarian society, and that wheat, that seed is a significant part. That's what's valuable, right, to the consumer. That we grow wheat for wheat, right, for the kernel of wheat, not for the plant. The plant gets shot out. That's called the chaff. And in that, what we see is Jesus flips this whole thing around. He says, here's what's valuable. That when people begin to understand the thing that I want them to leverage their life to do, it's not to be appreciated this seed. It's to give their life to be the plant that produces many seeds. The seed is valuable to the consumer. But what's valuable to the farmer, it's the plant that produces all of those seeds. So let's bring all of this together, because I want you to see the movement potential that the church that Jesus designed has across the world. That creating duplicates of Jesus that spread the light. He says, it could be just me with the light, but I'm going to take and create millions of lights. And this is going to sweep across this earth, and this is what is going to redeem the world. And that when we take and we begin to say, I'd rather die and multiply. Maybe there's something that I need to die to in order to live my life to multiply something significant. So I need to die to maybe this successful thing so I can multiply what this significance thing is, right? Die to success, multiply what is significant. And in this, what Jesus says is that's the pathway to the glory that is never ending, to something that matches your heart that is pointed towards eternity. And for all of us to say the most significant, the most purposeful thing that we can do is to be a part of what Jesus says. I'm going to create a movement that will sweep across this world. That Jesus has empowered, Jesus has equipped, Jesus has put everything within us that we need to make a difference in the culture around us. And so these are the things I need you to understand. This is what Jesus has said. But I also want you to understand how this is actualized in the world around us. So you might say, Keith, that sounds great, and that sounds like nifty little verses that you can pull out and help us understand how we're to live, but that's just inspiration. Here's where it gets down to nuts and bolts for those of you who think, has this ever happened before? So Jesus gives the potential of, hey, if you'll do this, hey, I'm going to have power. But here's what I want you to see. Over the last couple of years, I've studied the movements of the church in church history, and to study what's this look like. When people took Jesus seriously, what happened? And so when we go back to the very beginning, 120 people that hear Jesus say these things and actually believe Jesus and actually say, okay, Jesus, we're going to take you at your word that you want us to make duplicates of you that take the gospel, that spread it around, and you're going to empower this in some way to happen. And here's what I want you to see in terms of the historicity of people that get this movement. The first thing we're going to see is kind of the numbers of Christians that begin to rise and begin to understand what it looks like for them to be planted in a place and to be able to multiply out. And so the first thing I want you to see is this understanding of how this begins to play out in terms of the year 40 AD. just a few years after Jesus takes and leaves this earth, what we see is there's about 1,000 Christians that are there, 1,000 followers, 1,000 people that are people that are making disciples in this. What we begin to see is that in about 10 years, that goes up to about 1,400 people. So a marginal increase, and we begin to see this kind of catching on. What we begin to see then is in the next 50 years, that goes to about 7,434 people. Then another 50 years later, we begin to see we're less than 50,000, but right at that 40,000 mark. And this is the first time that we begin to see some statistical evidence of who they are as 0.07% of the population. Then in about 180, we see that go from 40,000 to 107,000. In 200, we begin to see that rapidly increase, almost double in size to 210,000. And here's where we begin to see the movement of Christianity from the very beginning, as we begin to see how Jesus architects this thing to actually reach create a movement among the people. And what we begin to see is at 250, we begin to go from 210,000 to 1.1 million people. And that begins to be 1.9% of the population. There we go, and just 50 years later, we're at 6 million people, and that is almost 10% of the population of Rome. Then we begin to see just 12 years later, that begins to escalate, and that goes to 8.9 million people, and then we begin to see at 350, this exponential increase to 31 million people, and that ends up being 52.9% of the population. If you are like, hey, these are too many numbers, let me give you a graph that shows you exactly how this works. As we begin to see this ratchet itself up, these are how, even just from 250 all the way to 350, how the movement of Christianity ultimately started out. And here's what they did. They just took Jesus seriously. If he makes duplicates of them who obey what he has to say, that he's going to empower that in a significant way. So that was then. That was, 1,700 years ago. Where do we see stuff happening now? Here's what, as I've looked across here in just our country, there's been a couple of things that we would say are the Great Awakenings. And in the Great Awakenings, what we begin to see is at the center of this was this new institution. And that was the institution of higher education. And as we begin to look globally, what we see is that the United States is the global leader of higher education. That there's really no one on a scale of what happens in the United States in terms of how many people are connected to this that do it better than the United States when it comes to higher education. And here's what we see. There's all kinds of these factors that go back into why the church expanded. What were the things around the rapid expansion of the church? But what I believe is that we're in a place where over the last 200 years, we've seen the rise of higher education as this moment for us to be able to see God potentially do some incredible things. And what we've seen is throughout the last couple of hundred years, we've seen movements. When movements happen in culture, it is through these things called college campuses, through college students. And this is this crazy, amazing thing that has happened even over the last 150 years. And let me give you 4 factors that I believe are incredibly strategic and relate back to the movement of Christianity. So this might get a little seminary, but I want you to get where we're going with this. I believe that God wants to do something, and the next movement in our culture is going to come through the college campus. And here's 4 reasons why. Number 1, college students are moldable. College students are moldable. Not moldy, but moldable, right? Moldy things in college campus or for college fridges. But as people, there's 2 places for us when we begin to think about the most significant times where our lives are changed. One is early childhood. In the very beginning of your life, a lot of things that make you who you are determined. You're highly moldable. There are things that are happening. But sociologists tell us there's another window, and that window is in the college years. That window is 18 to 24. When we begin to see what happens there, it's this second place where people have their trajectories of their lives transformed. And you might be a part of that. I was a part of that. I got into college thinking I was going to do one thing. Then God absolutely transformed my life. And it wasn't just God. This is just some of these things that we begin to see. People discover themselves. They begin to figure out who they are and how they're wired and what they're all about. And this begins to change the trajectory of their life. Number 2, college students are influential. When we begin to look at the globe, the top 2% most influential people are college graduates. The top 2%. These are future leaders. These are people that have the trajectory to get into places of influence. And this is incredibly significant. And there are people that disagree and say, no, the urban city centers are the place of influence. And here's what I believe. I believe that there's oftentimes content that comes out of people's lives, but that content is molded, is formed in the college campuses. And in that, what we begin to see is what begins to come out of those molding, out of those formative years, begins to transform all of culture. I believe that universities are at the very center of every significant movement in humanity. I mean, that's a crazy statement, but it's like this spring that starts up, and the college campuses are at the top of the hill, and everything flows down from this. That if you want to influence the world, influence the college campus. Number 3, college campuses create a high density of leaders. See, I believe that college campuses, man, what happens is they gather together the best and the brightest. Those who have the highest potential to be leaders and to change the world. What we begin to see, and this is the beauty of what we see, that throughout history, this has kind of been scattered around, and you'd have to find out where the high capacity people. But what colleges have done is to bring them all together, right? To bring them into certain places and to have this flexible culture in here, to be able to have these moments, to be able to have all these people in a high density be able to gather together. And then ultimately, oftentimes they're sent out, right? Because it's just a time and a place. But this is an incredible opportunity for the movement of the gospel to create something. You can identify a college student, right? There's something that happens here in this time when we begin to see in this place, this group of people resides here. Number 4, that college students are sendable. Maybe you don't believe this, but you are operating, if you're a college student, in the most flexible place of your life, right? The most flexible kind of context for you to make the decisions that might go in a lot of different directions. That you probably aren't yet tied down with any kind of spouse, or you don't have jobs yet. You don't have investments like houses. You likely don't have kids. And in this, what can happen is that college students are incredibly sendable in terms of being able to say, here's where I can go with my life. This is what this looks like. And here's what this is, just an incredible opportunity for us. As we begin to see this, I believe the collision of what Jesus says, here's what the church should be. And if we believe what Jesus says about the church, we've seen in history the expansion and the movement that it creates. Also at the same moment, in this place in history, we see that college campuses across our nation are ripe to be able to transform our culture. And here's what's happened. That this has happened repeatedly throughout the last 200 years. The people that are in this age group have begun to start things that transformed the world. And this has happened in almost every region in our nation, except for the Pacific Northwest. The Northwest, where we live, is the one place that we can look and say, in terms of a sweeping movement that has affected culture, in the history of the Northwest, we have not seen this yet. We have not seen this happen. And when you begin to look at other parts of the country, we've seen this. And here's what I believe. I believe in Resonate Church that because of all this, because we are people who God has saved in order to send, and in order for us to be empowered to make duplicates of Jesus, because we believe that college students and college towns are the most strategic places on earth to start a culture-changing movement, and because we believe that as leaders in your church, that we are called to be able to set a vision before you that isn't something that we just come up with, but something that takes seriously the Great Commission and the context of the world that we live in. Because of all these things, what we want to introduce today, what we want to set before you as your leaders is a vision for Resonate Church to reach 21 campuses by the year 2021. And this is this idea that we want to plant 21 churches on college campuses and in college towns by the year 2021. And here's what this means, that if we begin to see the expansion, if we begin to see and take seriously the multiplication, that we believe that this is something that is absolutely doable. That if we take seriously what Jesus says to us, that what we might be able to see might transform the very fabric of the Northwest. Because here's what happens when you begin to have disciples that make disciples, they come together to form churches. When you form churches, it begins to kind of create that flywheel effect that begin to really significantly increase the impact of the gospel. So I hope you hear me. This is a big moment that we have been praying for, to be able to say to you, Resonate, we believe that God is calling us to something really significant, that Scripture's never changed from this idea of what we've been called to create a movement in, and the places that we are sent, and the places we're called to, in the current context in history tells us that this is a moment that we want to seize for the kingdom of God. So let me tell you a little bit about how this is going to roll out and what this begins to look like. And I want to kind of go through and help you to understand the idea behind what it would look like to plant 21 churches by the year 2021. Let's go back to the very beginning of this thing. In 2007, what we saw was us plant a church here in Pullman. In this very building we started in 2007, we began to say, hey, we believe that college students are incredibly strategic, and that college towns and the adults that live here in this town are an incredibly strategic part of this. But that didn't stop there. In 2008, we had people that came over from Moscow. And we began to say, hey, let's not just take and integrate them. Let's start another church. Let's multiply over to Moscow. And we began to start a church that meets over, and still does to this day, in the New Art Theater over in Moscow. In 2012, we began to realize that God was pressing us again to not be stagnant and not just continue to kind of grow by addition, but to grow by multiplication and take what He said seriously about planting and growing plants, not just holding seeds in our hands. And we planted on the campus of Washington State University there in Todd Auditorium, and it still continues to be significant today. Not only that, but in 2013, we did the same thing over in Moscow, that we planted on the campus there at the University of Idaho. And this again was a significant thing for us as we begin to say that it is us multiplying, not just adding things. But that didn't stop there. In 2014, in Pullman, we took a team out of there that had been planning, that had been training in that, and they went to Central Washington University, and they planted a church there in Ellensburg at Central Washington University. Incredible idea, incredible moment for us. In 2015, this year, meeting earlier this morning in terms of what this looks like, for those of you who are in Cheney, you understand that this is what happened here. Was we took a group of people that had been trained up in Moscow, and we sent them to Cheney. And that's the current state of where we are right now with Resonate Church. But we believe that God is calling us to continue the process. And as you begin to see this, there's an idea there that in a context like Pullman and Moscow, what we're going to do is we're going to continue to have a moment, a place where we would identify leaders, train them up, and send them out, and kind of have this 2-year process to do this. And so you're going to see this go every other site. And this is the idea behind this. But let me tell you how this begins to expand out. You see, next year, here's what happens. that Pullman, we already have a team identified, a site pastor identified, that we're going to send them out to our next site. We're calling that Site 5 right now. And that's what happens in 2016. In 2017, a group from Moscow is training up right now, and they're going to have a year to kind of buckle down and be able to do this. And they're going to launch Site 6 as a team. But then what you begin to see is Ellensburg there, right? We planted Ellensburg, but we believe that it is feasible for us to be able to plant another church and to have a group of people that are trained up and leave as a team to be able to go out from a site after 3 years. And here's why we understand that we're building up leaders. And right now in Ellensburg, we believe that there's a significant amount of leaders that can be able to go out and plant a site. And this is this idea that every 3 years, or by the third year, what we'd see is a site mature in order for them to plant their own site. In 2018, we see Pullman plant Site 8, but now Cheney is in its third year and it's planting Site 9. In 2019, here's what we see, that Moscow is planting Site 10, that Ellensburg is now planting Site 11, but remember good old Site 5, right? Site 5 is now planting Site 12. Then in 2020, this is getting crazy now, but this is multiplication. This is the graph that goes up like that. Pullman's plant Site 13, Cheney plants Site 14, Site 6 now, we don't even know who those people are. They're planting Site 15. Site 7 is planting Site 16. And then in 2021, Moscow planting Site 17, Ellensburg planting Site 18, Site 5 planting Site 19, Site 8 planting Site 20, Site 9 plants Site 21. And here's what we begin to see, that in the context of the most sendable, reachable, influential group of people in human history gathered together in these dense geographic areas, taking Jesus' words seriously, that we might be able to create what Jesus has called us to do and to create a movement. And here's what it might look like as we begin to think about missions at $4 million, as we begin to see at 2021, here's just some of the realities. And in that, let's go to the next slide. We see attendance. We see people across the Northwest gathered together, over 6,000 people. And this is saying if we just keep the current statistics, if there's no growth and only multiplication, here's what this begins to look like. That Easter, there might be upwards of 15,000 people 6 years from now gathered together on college campuses. That in villages, there's over 4,000 people. That when we begin to see discipleship, we see people huddle at 2,800 people. 760 people say, man, I wanted to decide to follow Jesus with my life, and over 1,000 people get baptized and be able to say, this is what I'm pointing my life at. Let me show you what are some of the potentials for us as we begin to see what this looks like. So what we've done is tried to identify, there's about 28 on this list of potential places that we believe that the model of Resonate Church might work to expand to. There's some crazy places there. There's some things that you begin to say, what does this even look like? Let me go on to look at this, to see just as a map in the Northwest and in Canada, we begin to see the footprint of what this could look like and the movement that God could start in our midst through this. This is a significant thing. And every time I look at this and think through this, I get just a little fearful. But Jesus says over and over, hey, don't fear. Fear is not what I've called you to do. I've called you to be obedient. And I promise you, this church is not built upon flash, but it's built upon just obedience. For us just saying, hey, no one said that a church that points to college students could survive, and here we are at year 8. No one said that you could go and you can just multiply and do multi-site with college campuses, but here we are already doing this. And we believe that this is something that if we take seriously the call of Jesus on our life, that this could actually happen, and that we could see something significantly push out the gospel in a way that we've maybe never seen before on college campuses in the Northwest. And here's what I want you to hear. Our belief is that this is a vision that you are ready for, that this is not something I want you to be impressed with. This is something that just says if we take the Great Commission seriously, here's what multiplication looks like. This is a gigantic math problem that says let's try to be obedient. Because Jesus said in John 20:21, I'm sent, so I'm sending you. Let's take John 20:21 seriously and plant 21 churches by year 2021. That's the idea behind all of this, that he sent us that we might be able to do something significant with our lives. And we want to tie this together, and we want to help us to understand what this looks like. And so in this, our job as leaders is to be able to equip and to be able to point and help you to understand how you live your life. And so I want to ask you to do something. The next step for this is to be able to say, okay, God, if you've called us to do this, how do we do this? What does this look like? And for that, I want you to reach underneath your chair. There's a card underneath your chair. And I want you to just to take that and grab that real quick. If you're to say, what does it look like, Keith? How am I to respond to this? What should, in light of all these things that you're saying, what does this mean? What we've tried to do is just come up with something that creates clear next steps for us and to be able to say, here's what we believe that this would look like. And so in that, the first thing that I want you to see, the first thing I want to draw your attention to is there is a box with your name and your information on there. And I just want us to start there. This is not saying you're committing to anything, not at all, but I just want you to be able to knock that out before we get into the stuff that's going to require you to ask the Lord some things. So write down your name and your information on that. See, if you remember from the very beginning of this, that first box connects the dots to what we've walked through. The first time we talked about this and asking how we're to live the days of our lives, we were saying, here's the thing, we're not promised anything, but if we were just to take the average amount of days, it would lead us to the year 78 years. And if we were to take 78 years minus our current age, and if we were to come with that number, that's kind of the amount of years that we would have estimated to have left on this earth. And if we were to take and we were to multiply that by 365, that would give us a number. For some of you, that's over 20,000. For me, I'm a little bit older, so that is 14,610 days. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to do that math, or if you remember that number from being here over the last couple of weeks, I want you to write that number in that first blank. I want you to write that number in that first blank. So for me, it would be, I commit to point my 14,610 days to the mission of God. And here's what we want to say. We believe that God's mission for your life is the most significant way that you could live your life. And we believe that as he put something before us and say, here's how you could live your life, what I want to ask you to do is just if you would have the mentality that would say, how can I see my life as this one life that I have to give to God is just a blank check. A blank check to be able to say, God, what I want to do is I want to point my life to what you're doing in the world. I want to say my life is a blank check. Could you use me to do something that's bigger than me? Could you use my life in a way that would just blow my mind and be so much more significant than anything that I could choose to use to live my life? To say, I'm going to point the rest of my life to say, this is a blank check. God, use me how you would want to use me. And that's that first moment that I think we need to get to, is just asking, can you say that? Can you say, I want to be sent? The next idea for us is a box that's on there that says this: I commit to live sent towards those around me. And here's what we understand, that you've been given a little light, and that you have been asked by your Heavenly Father to take that little light and shine it in places that need that light, to shine it in dark places. And there's darkness all around us. Jesus says that he's going to give you power to be able to overcome that. But what was required of you is to, as the little song says, to not let your little light be hidden under a bushel. No. To let it shine. And here's what this looks like for us. So we can live our life and try to live towards Jesus and do it great, but it's a little bit like taking a stick of dynamite, lighting it and throwing it up in the air, and there's a big bang and there's lots of noise. but it doesn't do a whole lot. And I think a lot of times if we just say, I'm going to go to church and I'm going to just try to be a good person, it's a little bit like throwing a stick of dynamite in the air. It's flashy, it's seen, but there's another thing that we can do is we think about drilling down into the side of a mountain and taking that stick of dynamite and putting it down into this hole and deep within that, lighting that and seeing what happens. There's a significant difference. It's not just loud noise. It's not just a bright light. It's something that can move mountains. And we're saying, where would you be called to be planted in your life? That the power of the gospel could be drilled down into a group of people. Maybe that's architects. Maybe that's a sports team. Maybe that's people that you have a heart that's burdened for, that maybe you can't explain it, but there's just a group of people that you want to bring your little light to. Maybe it's a mom and you're surrounded by moms. Maybe you're a professional and this is what it looks like for you to be able to say, how does my little light shine in those kind of places? And so we put on there who. We put on there where, for you to be able to say, where would you plant your life? Where's God calling you to let your light shine? What does that look like for you? And how powerful it is when we as a church begin to say, hey, here's what we're sent to. Way bigger impact than just being a part of a church service. This campus and this town can be radically impacted if a group of people said, I'm going to take my light, I'm going to plant this stick of dynamite into this place, and it's going to change the landscape of this. Not only that, we put on there, would you be willing to commit to prayerfully considering going for 2 weeks, a trip of 2 weeks or longer in the next 12 months? Would you prayerfully consider this? And here's why this is a part of this, the now part of this. If you begin to say, what does this look like? Here's the power. That when we begin to go to other places and we stay longer than it means to be a tourist there, that we begin to see how the gospel begins to have a need, that it can be met in those kind of contexts. And then when we come back to this context, what we begin to see is things that we never saw before, because you live in your world, and oftentimes the needs and the places that the gospel could transform stuff, you're in it so much that you don't see it. But when we leave and come back, all of a sudden God begins to do something in our heart, and we're ignited with a passion to spread the word of God and to spread the glory of God and to spread this redemptive power to the world around us. We begin to see the needs around us. And this is a powerful thing for you to be able to say, I want to check one of those boxes. Be able to say, here's what I want to do to be able to live sent. But if you take that and you'd flip that over, especially for those of you who are college students, this is what you're going to do next. Oftentimes we don't realize trajectory-changing moments, but I hope for some of you this is one of them. I hope for some of you you've been praying about, God, hey, tell me what to do with my life. And today's a day that you begin to see God pointing you in a trajectory for the rest of your life. As you begin to look at that map and see all the different places, and to be able to say, hey, if God has called us to live this, if the moment in history says that college campuses in this church called Resonate Church could be a momentum building thing, could it be that I could take my life and I could point my career to getting a job in one of these 21 cities that we're going to try to plant a church with? And let me just be clear in this. This is not for you to say, hey, I want to move to this city so I can join the mega church there that has the great singles program, right? I want you to say, I want to move here so I can be a part of helping plant churches on college campuses. Would you consider just saying, I'm going to prayerfully consider getting a job in one of these cities so that I might be able to be a part of this movement? Even more than that, or not more than that, but in a significant degree as well, there's some of you that we would like to ask if you would consider being a part of a church plant team. You see, whenever we go out from a place, we send a team of people, and that team of people, there's some of them are full-time, there's some of them that have jobs on the side, but we're talking about people who are saying, hey, I want to be a part of this team, to be sent out. And if you are interested and you say, I want more information about what it would look like to be trained to plant a church, to be a part of a team that goes out and plants churches, we need a couple of hundred people over the next 6 years to be able to say, here am I, send me. I want to go to a college campus and be a part of a team. And maybe you're saying, hey, I feel like God's calling me to be a pastor, or I think God's calling me just to get a job and be a part of this as well, to be able to be in this, to be able to not just have a job and be a volunteer, but to kind of have leadership in this. And what we want to do is train you and invest and to be able to point you to how this could look in your life. And finally, there's some of you that we'd like to ask you if you would take and give 730 of your days to saying, I want to be a part of a church plant full-time after you graduate in vocational ministry. This just means that this is what you do for 2 years. And we're praying that there's a mass of you that would say, hey, I'll give, out of the 20,000 days that I have left, I'll give 730. And why 730? That's just 2 years. It's just this idea that what can be used if you would just say, I want to give 2 years to be able to plant churches on college campuses for the glory of God, because there's a movement that's waiting to happen. And this is what we're bringing together, and this is what I want to ask you guys to consider. Ask you guys to begin to believe what Jesus said about his church and begin to understand that your place in time and history is unique. And I really don't want to overstate this, but I think God's going to do something significant. I think that there's something that he wants to use us to do that is way beyond our capabilities, but he says, I'm going to give you power. And here's what I want you to get. Again, not that you're impressed with Resonate Church at all, but you just say, okay, God, I want to take you seriously. And I don't want you to feel any guilt. I don't want you to feel any pressure at this. This is us just saying we believe that we want to, as leadership, call you to the thing that God has already been calling you to. That we don't want to set some little bitty vision down here and say, hey, let's just hope we do this minimum amount. But beginning to see, here's what God has done throughout history. Let's not settle for anything less. And let's point our lives to something great. There's a quote that's attributed to Steve Jobs when he tried to recruit a guy named John Scully from Pepsi. And he says this, do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world? And that's just computers. I think God's calling us to say, what plan are we going to take with our life? There's a couple of different options. And I want to take a little bit of time here and give us a moment just to be able to pray, just to ask God. And here's what I want you to do right now. I want you to say, I want to set aside the fears of my heart. I want to set aside all the details that Keith didn't get into and how this is going to look like. I want to set aside all these things and just ask God, would you have a better plan than my plan? And then just be open. Just be open-handed. Just first in this moment to say, God, could my life be a blank check for you to use for your glory and not mine?